You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So welcome, friends. Jim Cantelon here. We are right in the midst of the book of Matthew, taking our time, as I always do, and we're in Matthew chapter 16. We've just come through the stories of the kosher controversies, the faith of a Canaanite woman, Jesus feeding 4,000, and now we're going to have more adversity from the religious leadership right after this break. So, Matthew 16. Just before we go there, I just want to reiterate, repetition reduces uncertainty, right? All I do with JCT is the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts because that's volume 2 of Luke, and John. That's all I do. The book of Revelation says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. I just want to tell the Jesus story and then let Jesus tell you the story for yourself by his Holy Spirit. I'll let others deal with other stuff, but it seems to me that we need to hear more about Jesus, and we need to, if you will, lift him up, in front of the public. We mustn't forget who Jesus was, who Jesus is, a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Well, anyway, I'll stop preaching. I'm going to teach. Matthew 16, verse 1. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, when evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. By the way, I don't know how they can see if the sky is red if it's overcast, but he's not mocking them, but he's just saying, you guys have a very strange weather system that you have in place, proclaiming this, proclaiming that, forecasting this, forecasting that. Anyway, these are the signs that you deal with. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Jesus then left them and went away. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They discussed them among themselves and said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you have little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000? How many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Whole tomes of information are available if you choose to research the histories and beliefs of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All I'll do here is provide a little thumbnail sketch. You might even call it a caricature of these groups, but I'll be true to what I've studied. The Pharisees were clean hands people. They touted the oral law or the oral Torah with a definite bias to the outward appearance. They tended to legalism and the apartness or separateness that often accompanies a sectarian view of life. They had low tolerance for the Roman occupiers in Jesus' day, and they had very low tolerance, even more low tolerance, for Gentiles in general. Gentiles were dogs, right? They saw themselves as the holy ones, and as is often the case with self-concept, guess what? They were holier than thou. It's always the way. The Sadducees were also Torah people, but not in the oral law sense. They had a low view of the hedge around the law that the Pharisees had built, and they adhered exclusively to the written Torah, the 5 books of the law of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That was it. They controlled the temple priesthood, and they owned the temple commerce. So time and again, their policies and their practices clashed with those of the Pharisees. And you would expect this because the Pharisees were kind of everyday guys. The Sadducees were the religious elite and the social elite. They were the ones that had the money because they controlled the hundreds of, if we put it in modern terms, the thousands and thousands, hundreds of, maybe billions of dollars over the years that came in to the temple 3 times a year at least during the big 3 festivals of the Jewish year. They had very fine homes, they had very fine clothes. Their children were very highly educated. They were a cut above, the pedestrian Pharisees. And they knew it. But often, because the Sadducees and the Pharisees had similar interests vis-a-vis the practice of religion and the adherence to Jewish law and so on, that, they clashed. The one body, the Pharisees, were more conservative. The other body, the Sadducees, were more liberal. And then there were, various, if you will, gradations, of rabbinic teachings, beneath these polarities that clashed, just one big clash. But it's interesting that even though they, in some cases, despised one another, Jesus united them in their mutual fear and hatred of his person and his ministry. On the subjects of the resurrection and the reality of the spirit world, they fought tooth and nail. And if you're interested in that, look at Acts 23, verses 6 to 10. Theology polarized them, but Jesus galvanized them. So once again, Jesus is asked for a sign. And I say once again because back in chapter 12, they asked him for a sign. And once again, back in chapter 12, he says the only sign he will give them is the sign of Jonah. He then turns on his heel and walks away. The sign of Jonah, what's that? To all intents and purposes, Jonah was dead, right? In that story. But on the 3rd day, he miraculously escaped and seemingly rose from the dead, although he didn't. But the sign of Jonah was, you think I'm gone, 3 days later I'm back. Now in Jesus' case, he really did die. In fact, the Apostle Paul makes this a critical component in his gospel, as he calls it, in 1 Corinthians 15. There's 4 components in Paul's gospel. Jesus died. He really died. Jesus was buried, a dead body in a tomb. He rose again, and he appeared to hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, real-time witnesses. He died, he was buried, he rose again, he appeared. Those are the 4 critical components of the Apostle Paul's doctrine, and everything he taught revolved around that. Resurrection, of course, was a concept the Sadducees just would not accept. Once you're dead, you're dead. There's none of this resurrection stuff. Nevertheless, they asked for a sign. Jesus says, okay, you want a sign? Sign of Jonah, which would immediately turn off the Sadducees. The Pharisees, on the other hand, I wonder what he means by that. Later, after crossing the lake, how many times did Jesus cross that lake? He warns the short-term memory lost disciples about the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It took them a while to clue in, but they finally got it. Jesus was warning them against both legalism and secularism. The legalism of the Pharisees, the secularism of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were Hellenists, meaning they were more Greek than Jews. The Hellenization of that part of the world had occurred, many years before under Alexander the Great. The Romans had picked up on that Hellenized culture, and they built something into it and had made it foundational to their view of the world. And it was a very secular worldview, although religious in the sense that there was the worship of the emperor and the worship of various little deities here and there. But essentially, in practice, it was a secular kind of life. And so the Sadducees basically appeased the Romans by not, if you will, offending them with regard to their secularism. And they appeared to the Romans to be as secular as the Romans were. Pharisees, on the other hand, not so much. And that's a part of the goodness of the Pharisees. They had at least a sense of the holiness that should accompany those who follow, the law of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nevertheless, Jesus wanted his disciples to embrace neither the left nor the right, but he wanted them to walk a highway above them both. And Jesus' way is the highway, it rises above human philosophy and predisposition. Great stuff. I'll be back right after this. Jim Cantelon has been a part of our ministry with Somebody Cares in Malawi the whole time we've been here, 22, 23 years. She is a dynamite praise and worship leader. She's a spark plug for all kinds of things. She's a pastor's wife, but she's also someone who lives with HIV and AIDS. And a big player for you has been not only the antiretrovirals, but also selenium.
Yes.
Tell us about selenium and the impact it has.
I started taking selenium in the year of 2006. And since then, my health was deteriorating due to HIV pandemic. I wasn't looking good, and even my weight gone down to 32 from 68. But since I was put on selenium, the immune booster, my health started boosting up to the point that in just 2 months taking selenium, my weight blow like up to starting to 78, and as I'm speaking right now, I'm weighing 96 kgs because of selenium. And since then, I've never been admitted at the hospital. I've never been sick. If I'm sick, it's just like flu because of the weather and things like that. But like going to the hospital frequently, I parted ways with that. And I also thank God because through God, by using Pastor Jim Cantelon and Mama Kathy, they've really changed my life. Even Mother Teresa Marila, she's the one who picked me up. She's the one who made me to be known by Jim and Kathy. So I'm really praising God because through this ministry and through the WOW team, they've built my life spiritually and physically, that I'm a well-known person today. I can praise the Lord every day, and I don't have to be shy with my status, because I know what God has done through the selenium, the immune.
And you know, Chipo, this is a light moment for me, but you're the first woman in history
Yes.
to talk about her weight without any hesitation.
I thank
But
God.
that's the thing.
I thank God.
I mean, HIV used to be called the slim disease.
Yes.
And you were very slim. And now
Very.
you're very healthy.
Look
And
at me.
Chipo, you are an amazement to us, and we love it when you lead in
Amen.
praise and worship. You're the best.
Amen. Thank you so much. I love you. Love you.
Okay, we're right in the middle of Matthew chapter 16. And let's see, what do we do here? Well, let's pick it up in verse 13 here. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea, or Caesarea, as we call it in Israel, Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades, or hell, will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Whoa. So, after a few days back in Galilee, Jesus and the disciples turned their faces north again, walking to the upper Galilee, all the way to the borders of Lebanon and Syria. And they stay in the region of Caesarea Philippi, which is modern-day Banias, Banias. This was the staging ground for both a profound statement of faith and an out-of-this-world moment when 3 of the 12 saw Jesus in his future glory. You want to take your time with chapter 16. Take your time. Now, this was one of the few times that Jesus was able to travel without a throng pressing upon him from every side. Matthew doesn't tell us why. So after a lengthy walk, probably taking a day and a half, Jesus finds a shady place by one of the mountain streams that flow near Caesarea Philippi to stop for refreshment, rest, conversation, bit of a camping spot. We don't know what the subject of the discussion was, but there were more than enough topics from recent teachings and miracles, I'm sure, to keep the talk well fueled. And at some point, the person of Jesus himself came up. He picked up on it and asked, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" "John the Baptist, Elijah, maybe Jeremiah, or one of the other Old Testament prophets." "And you? Who do you say I am?" asked Jesus. And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Little did Peter know that this confession would become foundational in the history of the church. Now, Jesus reacts with great enthusiasm, calling Peter blessed and crediting his spiritual sensitivity and availability to the Spirit of God the Father. A real compliment to Peter. And he goes on to declare that this confession, "You are the Messiah," would be the foundation stone upon which he would build his church. Now, there is a tradition out there, and it's a strong one, that Jesus was building the church on Petros, rock, that Peter was the rock on which Jesus was building the church. And of course, this became foundational to the whole concept of the Papa, the Pope, centuries later. But regardless of how you see this foundation will be impermeable to Satan's attacks. And the impermeability of the church is a really strong biblical theme, not of individuals, but the corporate body of believers. He also stated that the disciples would have profound authority on earth to proclaim and perform heaven's will. And then strangely, he told them to keep his messiahship to themselves. Now, I just want to point something out here. In verse 19, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And, there is that great tradition out there that this is the authority that Jesus is giving to Peter. But if you go over to chapter 18, also verse 18, he's talking to the disciples, and he says the same thing. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. It seems to me that what he's doing here is he's talking to the disciples as a body, not just to one individual. Whatever. Take it as you wish. But it is interesting that as he kind of explained the need for secrecy, something comes out. He's just commended Peter, but he's about to say something pretty striking about Peter here in a moment. Jesus knew that his messiahship would eventually be his undoing. He didn't shrink from this, although a timetable needed to be respected. From time to time he'd say, my time is not yet, okay? He knew it was coming, but it wasn't yet. But he did begin to reveal what is about to happen, much to the distress of the disciples. In fact, Peter couldn't take it and blurted, never, this will never happen to you. Never, never, never. So Jesus, who just commended Peter, says, get behind me, Satan. Now, don't overreact here. This didn't mean that Jesus thought Peter was Satan, but Peter's words reminded him of the temptation in the wilderness after his baptism by John. Luke 4 tells us that Satan, after finishing his tempting of Jesus, quote, left him until an opportune time, unquote. This may have been one of those opportune moments. Peter's words were the words of expediency, uttered with a nationalistic bias. Yes, Peter had spiritual insight, but he also had feet of clay. Satan took the opportunity to exploit him. Jesus, of course, didn't flinch. So the drama of the moment wasn't over. Jesus looked the disciples in the eye and warned them that one day they'd have their own crosses to bear. This was the price they would pay for being ambassadors of the kingdom. They would not be without reward, but the cost would be great. Then he said something that's occasioned many a debate. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Personally, I failed to see the difficulty in this statement. What was about to happen next, in my thinking, clearly explains it. And of course, I'm not alone in this view. But when you read it at face value, you say, whoa, 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 whoa. He hadn't even died yet, And there are those here who are not going to die until they see the Son of God coming in his kingdom. There's a disconnect here somehow. Well, this leads us into one of the most fascinating passages of all of the Bible. Chapter 17, verses 1 to 8. Let's read it. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them. A voice in the cloud said, This is my son whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Now, I've got to continue this in the next program. No question about it. And when we start the next show, I'll read this passage again. But let me just say this. Peter, James, and John were kind of the inner group of the inner group. The 12 disciples were, they were very close to Jesus. But closer still were the 3 of the 12, Peter, James, and John. And there were always so many others who followed, at least another 120 followed Jesus wherever he went. And sometimes he had thousands following him around. But Peter, James, and John are about to see something here that no man has ever seen in history apart from them. And it helps us to understand what Jesus meant when he said, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. He was referring to what was about to happen somewhere up there on Mount Hermon, on what we call the time of transfiguration. It's absolutely vital that we take our time with this, and so next program we will. Hi friends, Jim Cantelon here. I'm in Malawi in a very, very interesting setting where I am with a number of leaders who oversee various aspects of our partner ministry here called Somebody Cares. And I just might read some of what they represent. We have leaders here who are involved with youth, some with safe motherhood, others with granny's care, some in the health sector, some in the education sector, some in the legal sector, believe it or not, almost acting as paralegals, some as administrators, village pastors, and chiefs. And I have the great privilege of spending 2 or 3 hours with them, just taking them through some of the strong biblical principles that are, if you will, the infrastructure of the ministry of Somebody Cares. And so here they are. These are key leaders, chosen leaders, and they're all here to praise the Lord. Friends, I don't overdo this, but I do want you to know that there's more to JCT than meets the eye. And by that I mean those promotions you're seeing on the program for WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows, is an international charity my wife and I founded 25 years ago. And for all those 25 years, we've been working with the least of these, with orphans and widows impacted by HIV and AIDS, COVID-19, and other opportunistic diseases. We deal with basically those who are dying and minister to them as they pass away. We care for them with weekly visits, wonderful church-based volunteers. You can check out wowmission.com. Why don't you do that? wowmission.com, or on Instagram @wowmission, and find out more about our ministry. And when you support JCT, you're supporting WOW. When you're supporting WOW, you're supporting JCT. We are one and the same, and together, in righteousness and justice, we're trying to fulfill heaven's mandate.